The gunshot of the boarding door closing echoed through the cabin, a sharp finality that no one could ignore. Nathaniel Carter settled into seat 2A, the soft hum of the engines barely reaching his ears as he adjusted his tie, eyes scanning the empty space around him. A man in a tailored suit, with a briefcase at his feet, blending into the first-class cabin as though it were another business trip. To the world, he looked like just another successful executive. But tonight, he was anything but ordinary. Just as the plane began to taxi, a flight attendant, Melissa Grant, walked briskly through the aisles, checking seatbelts. Her eyes flicked over Nathaniel, lingering for a moment too long. And then, with a voice that echoed louder than the engines, she asked, "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Nathaniel didn't flinch. His calm, practiced demeanor gave no hint of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He handed over his phone, and the boarding pass lit up on the screen. But what happened next? The words that escaped her lips would turn this flight into something no one on board would ever forget. "This seat isn't for you. It's reserved for regulars." The whispered gasps of the nearby passengers were almost drowned by the sound of Nathaniel's heartbeat. Melissa's words hung in the air like smoke, thick with suspicion. She didn't know him. She didn't know who he was. But Nathaniel Carter knew exactly who he was and what he would not tolerate. "People like you don't belong here," she said, louder now, her voice brittle and sharp. In a moment, everything changed. The world outside continued its indifferent rotation, but inside this cabin, a confrontation was unfolding that would challenge the very fabric of power, dignity, and what it means to belong. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, calm, unwavering. The passengers, some glancing at their phones, were already starting to record. Their whispers picked up speed, and phones raised toward him like silent witnesses. The confrontation was no longer just about a seat. It was about everything Nathaniel had ever fought to overcome, a fight for his dignity, for his worth. Nathaniel Carter, the CEO of Aerostar Systems, had the power to ground flights with a single phone call. But tonight, it wasn't his title that would matter. It was his refusal to be stripped of his humanity. And as the cameras clicked on and the live stream began to spread, he made a choice that would change everything.
Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. I can't even begin to express how much I've missed you all. The moments we've shared, the memories we've built together, those have been the highlights of my journey. But, truth be told, it hasn't been easy. We've faced some tough challenges lately, technical issues that have left us struggling to keep up. I've been working non-stop to get everything back to normal, and I need you now more than ever. Your support means the world, and honestly, I don't know if I can keep going without it. If you've stuck with me this far, I'm incredibly grateful. So if you're ready to dive into this story with me, don't just sit there. Click that subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because tomorrow I'm bringing you a story even more powerful than today's, and you'll want to be here for it. Now, let's get back to the story.
Nathaniel Carter, at 45, had mastered the art of appearing unfazed. He wore success like a tailored suit, perfectly stitched, yet never truly comfortable. As the CEO of Aerostar Systems, one of the leading companies in aviation safety systems, Nathaniel had built a career from the ground up. But beneath the polished surface of his accomplishments, there was always a quiet, gnawing reality that not many people saw. Today, he was flying back to headquarters after a series of crucial meetings in Washington, the weight of his company's future pressing on his chest. As he entered the first-class cabin of Pacific Skies, his eyes instinctively scanned the room, his mind calculating and assessing every person in the vicinity. It was a skill he'd honed over the years, a radar for discomfort, for the stares, the sideways glances, the slow, deliberate movements of people when they realized who he was. It wasn't just the business world that had its prejudices, it was everywhere. In boardrooms, in airports, and even in the first-class section of a plane. He was used to it by now, but that didn't mean it was any easier to bear. The whispers were quieter now, but Nathaniel had learned long ago that silence could speak volumes. He had spent his entire career navigating the subtle ways people treated him differently, complimenting his accomplishments but never fully acknowledging his worth, questioning his authority but never saying it out loud.
His life had been one of constant adaptation, always walking the tightrope of excellence to prove that he deserved to be in the room, at the table, in that seat. But with each accomplishment, each milestone, he still felt like an outsider in spaces that should have been his by right. As Nathaniel settled into seat 2A, the soft hum of the airplane engines vibrated gently under him. He placed his briefcase at his feet, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the leather handle. The flight was routine, a few hours to unwind and get some work done. But even as he began to relax, he knew he couldn't fully let his guard down. His gaze flitted to the other passengers in the cabin, carefully avoiding eye contact with some, meeting others with a polite nod. As much as he wanted to relax, the feeling of being watched never fully left him. He had learned long ago that success wasn't enough to shield him from the silent biases of others. It didn't matter how many awards he'd won or how many deals he'd closed. In the eyes of some, he would always be other. Nathaniel's mind wandered to the boardroom moments earlier, where his presence had commanded respect, or so he hoped. A room full of executives, all accustomed to power, all accustomed to white faces. He was the only black man in the room. Again. But Nathaniel had long learned to adapt. He had become the voice of authority, of calm and confidence. He was the one who closed the deal, who fixed the problems others couldn't see. He had built his empire by making people forget about his race, focusing instead on his undeniable talent and determination.
Yet, in the silence of that first-class cabin, with its rich leather seats and gleaming overhead compartments, Nathaniel couldn't help but wonder if he was ever truly seen. Or if, like the world outside, the flight attendants, the passengers, and even the very airline would always see him as a figure to question, to doubt. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails as he tried to settle in. Despite the outward calm, the tension was always there, like a low hum beneath the surface, a constant fight for validation, the kind of fight that most people didn't even know they were witnessing. As the plane lifted off, the world outside became a blur of clouds and sky. But inside the cabin, Nathaniel remained alert. A small part of him, the part that had kept him fighting for all these years, kept watching, kept listening, always aware of the weight that came with his skin. And as the flight attendants began their rounds, Nathaniel found himself hoping, just for a moment, that today, maybe just maybe, he could simply be a passenger on a plane, with nothing to prove. But as he settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle he had fought his entire life was about to follow him, even into the sky. The moment the plane leveled out, Nathaniel felt a brief sigh of relief. His briefcase lay on the floor beside him, his phone screen glowing faintly in the dim cabin light. He glanced out the window, the bright blue sky stretching endlessly before him, a calm that contrasted sharply with the whirlwind of his thoughts. Business deals, upcoming meetings, corporate strategies, all the things he'd managed to master over the years. But the moment he relaxed, it was almost as if the universe found a way to remind him that peace was fleeting. It started with a soft voice at first, innocuous enough, but its edge sharpened with every passing second. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" Nathaniel's gaze shifted from the window to the flight attendant standing at the aisle, Melissa Grant. She was in her mid-30s, blonde, with a no-nonsense air about her. He'd seen her at the gate when he boarded, but he didn't think twice. She looked up, her eyes scanning his face for a moment longer than necessary before she spoke again. He didn't need to show her his pass again. It had already been checked at the gate, and his seat was confirmed. His ticket was first class, valid, confirmed, nothing unusual about it. But still, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, handing it to her without a word, trusting that her professionalism would handle it without incident. "Here you go," he said, offering a polite smile. She took the phone, but instead of scanning it and moving on, she lingered. Her fingers flicked across the screen in slow, deliberate movements, as though searching for something more. Nathaniel's brows furrowed, a sense of discomfort creeping up his spine. A beat passed. "Sir, this isn't right," she said, her tone sharp now, like a quiet accusation wrapped in the guise of professionalism. Nathaniel's pulse quickened slightly, his calm demeanor faltering. He shifted in his seat, then leaned forward, offering a polite but firm response. "I assure you, there's no issue. I've been checked in properly." She didn't respond right away. Instead, Melissa glanced over at her colleague, who was assisting passengers a few rows ahead. She looked back at Nathaniel, her gaze more intense now, like she was seeing something she didn't like. Her lips thinned into a tight line, as if holding back something more. "This is the first-class cabin, sir," she said, the words carrying an almost accusing weight. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just a question, it was a challenge, an accusation, unspoken but loud enough to hear. His gaze locked with hers, reading the unspoken judgment in her eyes. It was the same look he had seen countless times before, a glance that questioned his right to occupy space, to take up air. He wanted to push back, to say something, anything, but he remained still. His calm demeanor, practiced and perfected over years of dealing with subtle prejudices, kept him anchored. "I am," he said, his voice steady. "I've been traveling first class for years." The passengers around him, until now absorbed in their own worlds, began to shift in their seats. Some glanced up from their books, others peered over their seats. Their curiosity thickened the air. The subtle tension around Nathaniel deepened, like the quiet before a storm. But it wasn't just Melissa who had begun to notice. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Nathaniel could feel it. The eyes of everyone on him, the unease spreading like wildfire. He had been through moments like this before, but this time felt different. His patience was wearing thin. He could sense the undercurrent of something darker brewing, and yet he stayed silent, knowing better than to escalate things too quickly. "You do realize that people like you don't belong here," she said, her words sharp and clipped. The line wasn't loud, but it was laced with venom, deliberate in its implication. Nathaniel froze. The words hung in the air between them, charged with all the unspoken racism that had bubbled just beneath the surface of their interactions. He had been ready for the microaggressions, the condescension, but this was different. This wasn't a quiet look or a side-eyed judgment. This was a direct attack. For a moment, everything went still. Nathaniel felt a fire kindle in his chest. His breath caught. This was not the world he had fought for. This wasn't the world where success had been earned through merit alone. It was a world where people like him were constantly measured, constantly questioned. Then,
Before he could react, a flash of light caught his eye. A phone screen raised from a few rows behind him. Elena Morales, a young woman sitting 2 rows back, had started live streaming the confrontation. Her camera aimed squarely at Nathaniel, capturing his every move. The eyes of the plane turned to him. His face appeared in front of hundreds, thousands of strangers, captured in real time, as the situation began to snowball into something much larger than a simple seat dispute. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. His fight wasn't just for the seat. It wasn't just about a passenger being questioned. It was about a system that allowed this kind of humiliation to happen again and again.
He could feel the stares now, the silent judgment. He could feel the subtle shift in the air as this moment began to go viral. A camera clicked on. A live stream began. And Nathaniel knew that the stakes had just been raised. He stood, slowly, his eyes not leaving Melissa's. The calm that had settled in Nathaniel moments before felt like an illusion now. He gripped the armrest, his knuckles white, his breathing slow but deliberate. The words, "People like you don't belong here," kept echoing in his mind, each repetition cutting deeper than he'd like to admit. His gaze flickered to the seatbelt sign as the plane soared higher, the hum of the engines vibrating through his chest. It should have been just another business flight, another day, another task, but everything had shifted. He could feel the eyes on him now, silent, observant, waiting. Each passing second brought a new weight, like the cabin air had thickened, suffocating in its tension. The other passengers, some pretending to read, others pretending to sleep, were no longer so quiet. The subtle murmur of whispers began to grow louder, louder, until they were a chorus of judgment, as though every eye in the cabin had turned on him. The accusations, though masked in politeness, weren't just about the seat. Nathaniel knew that now. This was no longer about a boarding pass or a misplaced seat assignment. This was a confrontation that had been decades in the making, long before Aerostar systems, long before his rise to success, long before this plane had even taken off. As Melissa's voice rang out again, sharp and clipped, Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment. The weight of it all threatened to crush him, but his father's voice, that steady, firm voice from his childhood, rose to the surface like a lighthouse in a storm. Never let them take your dignity, son. Never let them reduce you to what they want you to be. Stand tall, stand firm. You are just as worthy as anyone in this room, maybe more. The memory burned, and it was the only thing keeping Nathaniel from lashing out. His father had taught him early on that the world would not see him the way he saw himself. But that didn't mean he had to accept their view. No, it was a lesson that had shaped Nathaniel from childhood, a foundation upon which his every success had been built. He had worked so hard to get to this moment. Every deal he'd closed, every setback he'd overcome, had been to prove to himself and the world that he deserved to be here. And yet, here he was, fighting for his seat in a place he had paid for, a place that had never belonged to anyone but him. The flight attendant's voice pierced the silence once more. "Sir, this isn't your seat," she said, her words pointed now, more accusatory than before. She wasn't just questioning his boarding pass. She was questioning his right to exist in this space. The tension in her eyes made that clear. She wasn't just doing her job anymore. She was making a statement. Nathaniel's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the situation pushing down on him like an avalanche. This was no longer just a disagreement. It was an attack. It was bigger than him, bigger than the first-class cabin or the airline. It was a reminder of the everyday struggles, the quiet battle he had fought his whole life, the battle against prejudice, against being seen as other, as less than. His composure was all that stood between him and chaos. He refused to be that man, the angry black man who would give them an excuse to throw him off the plane, to make him the villain in his own story. He could feel the phone cameras, the live stream that was rapidly picking up traction, capturing every moment, every twitch of his face. Elena's voice in the background, the casual clicking of other passengers recording. The moment had already gone viral. The stakes had been raised, and Nathaniel knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. As Melissa spoke again, Nathaniel's body tensed. Her eyes narrowed, and her tone had shifted from questioning to something more dangerous. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words rang in the stillness of the cabin like a bell tolling, a verdict passed without trial. The passengers around them were no longer just passive observers. Nathaniel could hear them now, their murmurs louder, more insistent. The whispers about him, the quiet judgment, they were no longer whispers. They were out loud, a chorus of uncertainty and disdain. Some looked at him with pity, some with apprehension, others simply with confusion. But one thing was clear: they were watching. The plane had gone from being a space of quiet refuge to a battleground with Nathaniel standing in the center of it all. He was the target now, a symbol of something larger. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a black man in a space that had not been designed for him to occupy, and that made him a threat. His heart pounded in his chest as the tension built, but he remained still, his face a mask of composure. He had worked his whole life to be calm under pressure, to never let his emotions take control. But inside, a storm raged.
The flight attendant took another step closer. Her eyes locked on his with a look that seemed to say, "You're not welcome here." Nathaniel felt it like a physical shove, a push against everything he had fought for. But he stood his ground. "I'm not leaving," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but firm. It was a decision he had made, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And then, as if on cue, the plane's atmosphere shifted even further. A low murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers began to shift in their seats, some making phone calls, others tapping away at their keyboards or opening their notebooks. The tension was now palpable, an invisible weight that pressed down on every person in the cabin. Nathaniel locked eyes with Elena, who had stopped filming for a brief moment. She met his gaze with a look that conveyed more than words ever could. "This will not be forgotten." In that moment, Nathaniel realized something. This wasn't just about a seat. This was about a world that had too often made him fight for every inch of ground he stood on. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. As Nathaniel remains calm in the face of Melissa's harsh accusations, the weight of every gaze in the cabin falls on him. He doesn't shout. He doesn't retaliate. His silence speaks volumes, cutting through the tension like a blade. But here's the real question. How many times have we stayed silent in the face of injustice just to avoid conflict? How many times have we turned a blind eye when we saw someone being treated unfairly, thinking it wasn't our problem, or worse, telling ourselves, it's not that bad? Nathaniel is not just fighting for his seat on this flight. He's fighting for the dignity that we all deserve. Yet so many of us have been on the receiving end of these small slights, these everyday prejudices. What have you done in those moments? Don't let this moment pass you by without considering your own role in fighting for what's right. If you stand with Nathaniel, drop a comment. But if you've ever been the silent observer, ask yourself, what would you do if the tables were turned?
The plane had become a battleground, silent yet charged with palpable energy, the air thick with judgment. Nathaniel felt every pair of eyes on him,
the weight of their scrutiny heavier with each passing second. He stood still, his jaw clenched, every muscle in his body primed to react. But he didn't move. He couldn't. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something far more insidious, something that had followed him his entire life. The idea that he, a black man, would always have to prove his worth, would always have to fight for spaces that were never meant for him. Melissa's words hung in the air like an accusation, her eyes narrowing in a mixture of disdain and suspicion. "People like you don't belong here," she said again, her voice now tinged with something darker, more dangerous. And then it clicked. It wasn't just about his seat. It was never just about that. It was about who he was, where he was allowed to be, the boundaries others tried to draw for him, as if he didn't belong in the places he'd worked so hard to enter. Her words, seemingly casual, now cut through the tension with surgical precision. "People like you." The phrase echoed in Nathaniel's mind, louder than the engine roar outside. In an instant, the weight of her prejudices became clear. This wasn't a flight attendant just doing her job. This wasn't an innocent mistake, no. This was the raw, ugly truth of racism laid bare. Nathaniel's body stiffened. His mind raced. He wasn't just fighting for a seat. No. He was up against a system, one that had been ingrained in society for centuries, where the value of his presence in this space was constantly questioned. The flight had turned into a microcosm of everything Nathaniel had fought against. The subtle, the covert, the everyday racism that wore 1,000 faces, dressed in civility and politeness, but hiding something far more toxic beneath the surface. And here, in this moment, it had revealed itself in full force. Melissa's actions weren't just a personal attack, they were a reflection of a deeper, more institutionalized prejudice. She wasn't just a rogue flight attendant. She was a symptom of something larger, something he had been battling his whole life, in the boardrooms, in the streets, and now, here, in this confined space. The passengers, who had been quiet observers until now, began to shift in their seats, some nervously glancing between Nathaniel and Melissa, while others seemed oddly comfortable in the silence. Elena, the woman filming the interaction, had not moved her phone an inch. The live stream was picking up steam now, viewers commenting, weighing in, and fueling the growing fire of tension in the cabin. Some of the passengers began to murmur, their voices just low enough for Nathaniel to catch snippets. He heard words like unbelievable, ridiculous, and that's not right. And then there were others, those who remained silent, avoiding eye contact, perhaps not wanting to get involved. A few even looked away, pretending not to notice. It was as if the room had divided into two worlds, one of silent complicity and another of vocal defiance. And in that moment, Nathaniel realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a fight between him and Melissa anymore. This was a fight between those who saw the truth and those who chose to look away. He had always prided himself on staying above the fray, on being the composed, unshakable figure that others looked to for leadership. But the fight had changed. It wasn't just about his seat. It wasn't just about whether or not he was in the right place. No, it was about every person who had ever faced this kind of humiliation. This moment was bigger than him. This moment belonged to all of them. Suddenly, he wasn't just Nathaniel Carter, CEO of Aerostar Systems. He was the voice of countless individuals who had been made to feel small, inferior, out of place, no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they accomplished. A fire lit inside him, not the hot,
impulsive rage that he had learned to suppress so many times, but a steady, undeniable flame of clarity. He had a choice now. He could back down, he could let this moment pass and retreat to his quiet corner of the world, silently angry but safe. Or he could stand tall, right here, in front of all these people, and make his stand. He glanced at the passengers around him once more, some with their phones raised, others with their eyes lowered in discomfort, still others just watching, waiting for someone to make the first move.
Nathaniel's eyes locked on Elena's, her phone camera capturing every second. He could feel the weight of the world pressing on him. This wasn't just a personal moment. This was going to be broadcast for the world to see. And as the final realization hit him, Nathaniel stood straighter, his voice ringing out clear and loud. "I'm not leaving," he said, his words steady, calm, resolute. The cabin fell into a stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. They all waited. The flight attendant, her expression now one of barely contained frustration, took a step back. She had no response, no words to match the quiet strength in Nathaniel's stance. The battle was no longer between him and Melissa. It was about something far bigger. And Nathaniel knew, deep down, that this was the moment he would either stand for what was right or lose something far more precious than a seat in first class. The cabin was heavy with silence now, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The eyes of the passengers no longer just observed, now they held judgment. Some were still filming, others had put their phones down, but the weight of the moment lingered like smoke in the air. Nathaniel could feel every gaze on him, each one an invisible weight, pushing him further into the dark corner of his mind. Melissa had stepped away briefly, but the brief respite offered no comfort. She returned moments later with a flight supervisor, another man, his face impassive, his demeanor almost bored. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. This was no longer a simple dispute over a seat. It was becoming a spectacle, a fight for his dignity that would soon play out in front of hundreds of people, captured and broadcast for the world to judge. Melissa's voice cut through the tension. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she said, louder now, her voice brittle with authority. Nathaniel didn't flinch, but something inside him shifted. The fight had taken on a new dimension. She wasn't just challenging his right to sit in first class anymore. She was challenging his entire existence in spaces where he belonged, where he had earned his place. And with each word, with each move she made, Nathaniel could feel the ground beneath him crumbling. The flight supervisor stood back, waiting for Nathaniel to comply, as if this were just another routine decision, just another insignificant passenger dispute. But to Nathaniel, it was everything. It was the culmination of years of subtle dismissals, quiet judgments, and unspoken barriers. Years of climbing higher and higher, only to find that each rung on the ladder was built for someone else. Every room he entered, every boardroom he led, every flight he took, he had always known, deep down, that he had to work harder, be better, just to prove he belonged.
But today was different. His mind raced, but his body remained still. The silence of the cabin wrapped around him, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. His fingers dug into the armrests, the leather cold against his skin. He wanted to speak, to demand that they see him for what he truly was, not just a black man in a first-class seat, but a human being, deserving of respect. But the words seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. The fear that gripped his chest wasn't just fear of being removed from the flight. It was the fear of becoming the very stereotype that society had built for him. The fear of becoming that angry black man who'd been wronged,
but who would be discarded without a second thought. And worse, he feared the humiliation. The thought of being escorted off this plane in front of all these people, his dignity stripped away with the same swiftness that had accompanied his rise to success. The quiet murmur of voices surrounding him felt like a drumbeat, relentless and deafening. How could I let this happen? Nathaniel's eyes flickered momentarily to the window, to the vast sky outside, a sky that seemed so far away from the confines of this cramped cabin. How had things gotten so out of hand? It was just a seat, but it had never been just about the seat. It had never been about any of it. The seat was merely a symbol, a reminder of every time he had been made to feel less than, despite all that he had achieved.
He thought of his daughter, Maya, only 10 years old, but already sharp, already aware of the world's prejudices. He had promised her many times that things would get better, that they would make sure the world would see her for who she truly was. She wouldn't have to fight the same battles he had. But here he was, fighting for something as simple as respect, as basic as dignity. How could he look her in the eye after this? How could he tell her that he had been beaten publicly in a battle he should have never had to fight? His father's voice came to him then, as it always did in moments of doubt, his steady words echoing in Nathaniel's mind. "Son, you can't let them make you feel small. If you give in now, you give in forever." The words cut through the fog of his despair like a flash of light. They weren't just words of advice, they were a command, a reminder of who he was, of who he had become. Nathaniel had faced worse, he had survived worse, and no matter how much this moment seemed to break him, he would not surrender to it. He couldn't afford to. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm the storm inside him. The room was still, the voices of the passengers around him were hushed. He could feel the supervisor's eyes on him, waiting for him to react. But Nathaniel didn't. He remained still, rooted to his place, his eyes locked on Melissa's.
"I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm, though it trembled slightly under the weight of everything he was carrying. "You can't make me." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a promise that he would not give in, no matter how much they tried to tear him down. The flight attendant's face hardened, but there was nothing she could say. She had already crossed a line, and Nathaniel had made his stand. The tension in the cabin was unbearable now, like the silence before a storm. Nathaniel didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. This was the moment that would define him. This was where he either let them take his dignity or he fought for it. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The moment stretched endlessly, as if time itself had come to a standstill. Nathaniel's breath, shallow at first, began to steady. Every eye in the cabin was fixed on him, waiting for him to either crumble or rise to meet this challenge. The fear that had gripped him earlier, the cold, suffocating dread of being removed from the plane, humiliated in front of hundreds, began to ebb away, replaced by something far more powerful, something that had been buried deep inside him, lying dormant, until now. Nathaniel had always been the calm one, the composed leader. In boardrooms, in press conferences, in the toughest of negotiations, he had worn his unshakable resolve like armor. But this was different. This wasn't a deal to be made or a crisis to be solved with logic and reason. This was personal. This was his dignity, his identity, and his worth being challenged in the most public way possible.
And yet, as he stood there, in that cramped first-class cabin, surrounded by murmurs and judgment, something clicked inside him, a clarity that had eluded him for so long. His father's words, the ones he had heard 1,000 times growing up, echoed in his mind, louder than ever. "Son, never let them make you feel small.
You have the right to stand tall, no matter what they say. If you give in now, you give in forever." The weight of those words hit him like a thunderclap. His father's voice, firm and unyielding, cutting through the haze of his doubt. Nathaniel realized that this moment wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't even about Melissa or the passengers watching him. It was about him, and him alone. It was about the years of fighting to belong, to be seen as more than just a token, to prove that his success wasn't a fluke, that he had earned his place in every room, every space, every conversation. He had worked his whole life for this, and he would be damned if he let anyone strip that from him now. He stood taller, his spine straightening, a sense of inner strength flooding his chest. The quiet hum of the engines outside, the soft chatter of the passengers, the light click of phone cameras, they all seemed to fade into the background as Nathaniel's focus sharpened. He wasn't just standing up for a seat, he was standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Every person who had fought for space in a world that told them they were never enough. His resolve was no longer just for him, it was for all of them.
He looked Melissa directly in the eyes, her expression a mix of confusion and defiance. She expected him to back down. She expected him to apologize, to shrink, to acquiesce to her authority. But Nathaniel wasn't that man anymore. His voice broke the silence, calm but powerful. "I'm not leaving," he said, the words coming from a place deep inside him, his heart, his soul, his very core. "This is my seat. I paid for it, and I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Nathaniel's words were quiet, but they were absolute. There was no room for negotiation, no room for doubt. His stance, firm and unwavering, sent a clear message to everyone watching. He would not bend. Not now, not ever. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Nathaniel felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. The tightness in his chest eased, the suffocating pressure lifted. He had reclaimed something that had always been his dignity. He had found the strength within himself to stand firm, to say no, and to demand the respect he had fought so hard to earn. His father had taught him that real strength wasn't about physical power or even financial success. It was about standing up when the world tried to knock you down. It was about never letting anyone define your worth, never letting anyone make you feel small. Nathaniel took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying himself as he prepared for whatever would come next. He didn't know how this would end, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't care. This moment, this fight for dignity, was his to win or lose, and Nathaniel Carter was not about to lose.
The tension in the cabin was suffocating. The eyes of every passenger were now on Nathaniel. The whispering hushed as the confrontation reached its boiling point. The flight supervisor, the tall, imposing figure in a crisp uniform, had finally arrived. His face was unreadable, but Nathaniel could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes as he took in the scene. The flight attendant, Melissa, was standing near the aisle, her posture rigid with authority, though her eyes betrayed her discomfort. The passengers sat still, the air charged with anticipation, waiting for the next move. Nathaniel could feel the weight of their stares on him, some sympathetic, others silent in their uncertainty. Elena's phone was still raised, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. It had gone viral by now. The world was watching. The flight supervisor's eyes flicked over to Nathaniel, then back to Melissa. The tension between them was palpable, as though a silent battle was playing out in the space between words. "Sir," the supervisor began, his voice measured but hesitant, "we need to resolve this matter. Please, come with me." Nathaniel stood tall, his posture unwavering, his voice steady as the calm before a storm. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his words filling the cabin with certainty. He met the supervisor's gaze head-on. "This is my seat. I paid for it, and you know that."
The supervisor hesitated, his brow furrowing. The quiet murmur among the passengers intensified, like the air before a storm. They had seen this play out in corporate boardrooms, in courtrooms, in the streets. A powerful man standing up against an unjust system. The world had seen it before, but it hadn't been quite like this, not on an airplane, not like this, not with the stakes so high. Melissa shifted uneasily, her fingers twitching, unsure of her next move. She knew what she had done, knew the tension was building around her, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She opened her mouth to speak, but Nathaniel's voice cut through the room. "No, I'm not finished yet." The flight supervisor's eyes flicked nervously between them, his face taut with the realization that this wasn't a simple situation to resolve. He could see it now. The passengers were taking sides, some beginning to rise in support of Nathaniel. His discomfort was obvious. Nathaniel's calm facade cracked slightly, and he felt the surge of energy rise from within him, every injustice he had faced in his life flowing through him in a moment of undeniable clarity. "Let me make something clear," Nathaniel continued, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. "You know who I am. I am Nathaniel Carter, the CEO of Aerostar Systems, the very company that maintains your aircraft." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, striking everyone in the cabin. Elena's phone stilled for a moment, and even Melissa froze, her face draining of color. The revelation was shocking, but it wasn't just about his position. It was the weight of the truth. Nathaniel Carter, the man they had so readily judged, had the power to bring Pacific Skies to its knees.
"I'm the one who ensures your planes are safe, the one who guarantees the systems that keep your airline in the sky. And yet, I'm treated like a threat because I'm black? That's where we are, isn't it?" Nathaniel's voice rose, but it wasn't with anger. It was the quiet rage of someone who had been pushed too far, the pain of countless microaggressions boiling over into something he couldn't and wouldn't ignore anymore. His gaze shifted to the passengers now, who were watching him in stunned silence. The supervisor shifted his weight, unsure how to respond. But it didn't matter. "Melissa," Nathaniel said, his voice cold but full of resolve, "you've done more than humiliate me. You've exposed the ugly truth of a system that treats people like me as invisible. Your behavior is the reason so many of us fight just to exist in spaces where we're supposed to belong." The cabin was still. Not a single person moved. Melissa's face was red, but she said nothing. The fight was over for her. It was over for everyone who had tried to undermine Nathaniel. Nathaniel's resolve hardened, but his words softened like the calm after the storm. "I'm not just here to fight for a seat or to win this moment. I'm here to demand accountability, not just for myself, but for the system that allowed this injustice to happen. I've worked my whole life to earn my place, and I refuse to let anyone take that from me. Not now, not ever." The weight of his words was undeniable. There was no more room for ambiguity, no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't just about one man in a seat. It was about the millions who had been treated like this, who had been silenced, erased, and marginalized.
The flight supervisor looked around the cabin, and for the first time, Nathaniel saw something shift in his eyes. Recognition, understanding, maybe even shame. He cleared his throat, stepping back slightly, his hands twitching at his sides. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice no longer carrying the same authority. "We'll make sure this is handled properly." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was the beginning of something more. Nathaniel had made them see him, forced them to acknowledge him, not as a threat, but as a person, worthy of respect. The passengers erupted into whispers, some nodding in agreement, others still unsure of what had just transpired. But Nathaniel didn't care. He had done what he came to do. He had stood for himself, and for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Melissa took a step back, her eyes cast downward, her authority shattered. The tension that had once filled the cabin began to dissipate, the silence replaced by a quiet murmur of recognition. Nathaniel stood tall, his heart pounding but his spirit unbroken. He had made his stand. He had fought for dignity, not just his own, but for all those who had been made to feel less than. And for the first time that day, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. The days following the confrontation on the plane moved in a blur, each one feeling like a turning point. Nathaniel's stand had sent shockwaves through the media, igniting conversations about race, power, and respect in the workplace and in public spaces. His story became a rallying cry, not just for those who had seen the injustice firsthand, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, overlooked, or invisible.
Pacific Skies could no longer pretend that what had happened on that flight was an isolated incident. The public outcry was swift and relentless. Social media erupted, and corporate offices scrambled to address the growing tide of calls for accountability. It didn't take long for the board of directors to reach out to Nathaniel. They knew what was at stake, both for their reputation and for the future of their airline. Nathaniel walked into the boardroom with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through the most difficult moments of his life. He had been through enough corporate meetings to know that words would only go so far. This time, he wasn't there to negotiate. He wasn't there to beg for an apology. He was there to demand action. The board members shifted in their seats, uneasy under his gaze. But Nathaniel didn't flinch. He knew the value of his presence, knew that he was no longer just a man in a suit, but a symbol of what could happen when people decided to stand up and fight. "I'm not here to negotiate with you," Nathaniel began, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm here to make sure this never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone. Pacific Skies will issue a public apology, not just to me, but to the millions of people who have faced the same discrimination, the same microaggressions, the same degradation in their everyday lives. And I will not leave this room until you commit to systemic reforms that will hold your employees accountable." The board members exchanged nervous glances, but Nathaniel's presence was undeniable. His voice was unshakable, and his resolve had only grown stronger since the incident. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a catalyst for change.
"I am also asking for the immediate termination of the staff involved in this incident," Nathaniel continued, his eyes narrowing as he looked around the room. Melissa Grant's actions were not just a violation of protocol. They were a reflection of a culture that Pacific Skies has allowed to thrive unchecked. If you truly want to move forward, you need to show the world that you are serious about change. The room was still. No one spoke. The silence stretched, but Nathaniel knew it wasn't because they didn't understand. It was because they knew he was right. In the end, the company agreed to his demands. A public apology was issued within 24 hours, and Pacific Skies announced sweeping reforms aimed at addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion in every aspect of their operations, from hiring practices to customer service training. Melissa Grant, along with other staff members who had been complicit, was dismissed. Nathaniel had won not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been forced to endure similar treatment. But this victory was not just about a single incident. It was about setting a precedent, a wake-up call for the airline industry and the world.
Nathaniel's actions reverberated far beyond the confines of Pacific Skies, prompting other corporations to take a hard look at their own practices. His story became a case study in accountability and the power of standing up for what was right. As the news coverage died down, Nathaniel found himself back at his desk, his thoughts drifting to his daughter. Maya had watched the entire drama unfold from the comfort of their living room, her young face full of questions, but also a new understanding of the world's complexities. He had promised her that things would get better, that she wouldn't have to fight the same battles he did. But as he thought about what had just transpired, Nathaniel realized that his fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The reforms at Pacific Skies were a start, but the world was still a long way from where it needed to be. There were still countless battles to be fought, for justice, for equality, for dignity. As he left the boardroom, the weight of his father's words echoed in his mind. If you give in now, you give in forever. Nathaniel walked out of the building, the cool air brushing against his face as he stepped into the street. He knew this fight wasn't over. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. But today, he had made a difference. Today, he had fought not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. And that was just the beginning. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. If you found this story gripping, the next one will take you even deeper into the unexpected. It's full of twists and turns that you won't want to miss. Click the image on your screen now to dive into the next chapter of this incredible journey.